Um, recording is in progress. Excellent. So housekeeping, of course, during the presentation, if you would keep your cameras off and your microphones muted, that would be great. Melba's going to speak, and then at the end, you will have opportunities for questions and answers, and you will post your questions in the chat. And Alicia Keenan, who is working behind the scenes here, she's the chair of our Racial Justice Committee, will curate these questions, send them to me, and I will present them to Melba when the time has come. Okay. So without further ado, we have again returning to us Melba Pearson. Melba is an attorney specializing in civil rights and criminal law with an emphasis on policy. She is the director of policy and programs for FIU's Center for the Administration of Justice, as well as senior fellow and faculty in the Department of Criminology and Criminal Justice. Her work centers on the expansion of the use of prosecutorial performance indicators for more transparency, equity, and racial justice in the criminal justice system. Before joining FIU, Ms. Pearson spent 3 years as deputy director of the ACLU Florida, where she worked to change police practices, expand voting rights, and reform the criminal justice system. Previously, Ms. Pearson was an assistant state attorney in Miami-Dade County for 16 years, culminating as assistant chief in the career criminal robbery unit, supervising junior attorneys while prosecuting homicides. In 2020, she received close to 155,000 votes as a candidate for Miami-Dade state attorney. So we are so excited to have you back with us, Melba. Thank you again for coming. And I can't wait to hear what you're going to share with us today.
Great. Thank you so much for that, Cynthia, and greetings to all of the ACLU friends, family, and supporters. This is always a homecoming for me, so I always enjoy being in this space with all of you, being in community, and talking about issues that really matter, that really change or can change the way that our country looks, the way that our state looks, the way that our community looks, making sure that there's equity and justice for everyone. So my comments today are going to be very centered around Dr. King, seeing that his actual birthday, I believe, is tomorrow, or if it's not tomorrow, it's Thursday, and we celebrate his birthday on Monday. But it's really interesting, especially around this time of the year, that everyone kind of dusts off their old Dr. King quotes and says, justice, injustice, basically justice delayed, justice denied, that sort of thing, talking about judging someone by the content of the character and not the color of their skin. And, they really pull from the I have a dream speech and sort of kind of marginalize Dr. King's experience into that one moment in time. But the 38 years he was on this planet and the 10 to 15 years that he was super active and leading the civil rights movement, there was so much more to look at, to absorb from the work that he did that just often gets swept under the rug. And especially as we're dealing with this pushback around teaching accurate history, as we deal with the drama around critical race theory. And I call it a drama because it really isn't a thing, right? It's literally teaching history and teaching the fact that, systems were put in place to oppress an entire group of people. How can we make sure that this doesn't happen again, right? So in that context of this pushback, I just think it's really important to really discuss what Dr. King was really about and make sure the sanitized, whitewashed version isn't what everyone is left with, and that people really glean the lessons from his work, from his life's work. So first of all, I'm going to talk about it from 3 different points of view, talking about it from a protest standpoint, from an economic standpoint, and from an allyship standpoint. And lastly, I'm going to conclude with readings from his letter from a Birmingham jail, which I think again lays down some very concrete lessons and concerns about folks that say that they're allies, but don't actually walk the walk, right? And I think we see a lot of parallels to that today, especially in the wake of what happened with George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and so many others, that summer of unrest where people were protesting and hitting the streets, and people really reacting to that horrible video that we saw of the murder of George Floyd. And sort of like at that moment, that groundswell of people being like, Black Lives Matter, and everybody's posting stuff on social media, and all these corporations are like, yeah, we're here for the movement. And a year later, how many dollars have actually been donated to communities of color, and making sure that their capacity is being built in these communities? How many people are still volunteering for causes, right? A lot of it was very showy, and everybody was out there, but where was the follow-up? Where was the work? So I'd like to draw those parallels from back then to today, because history rhymes. It doesn't repeat itself necessarily. It rhymes. It has a rhythm, and certain themes just keep reoccurring, especially when it comes to who's a real one and who isn't, to use the colloquial. So to talk about this from the protest perspective, got to be really clear.
1-5 is not available. At the tone, please record your message. When you've finished recording, you may hang up or...
Okay, so talking about this from the protest perspective, folks really think about, the right way to protest is what Dr. King did. I mean, we'll hear that sort of rhetoric these days, right? Where it's just, he was nonviolent. I really disagree with what Black Lives Matter does, et cetera, et cetera. But to kind of give the real context, folks honor him now, and they give him his flowers, and they talk about how amazing he was and this and that. But at the actual time in the 60s, the 50s and 60s, when he was organizing protests and, involved in the Montgomery bus boycott, as well as, boycotting different businesses, because you couldn't just come in and sit down at any table that you wanted to if you were an African American. At the time that he was doing this work, only 30% of Americans supported what he was doing. 30%. When you think about that in the context today, Black Lives Matter, the organization, has about a 30% approval rating. So again, history is rhyming. He preached nonviolence, right? He was very clear about that. But there were so many occasions where his marches went sideways, right? Like basically, he had a group of folks that were out there being nonviolent. They get attacked, whether it be by racists, by Klansmen, by police officers, which could all be one and the same at that particular point in time, and sometimes today as well. And, there would be instances where there was violence and people would get hurt, people would get arrested. There was looting, different things happened. And I think one of the things that really brings that home is that there's a cartoon. And if I can find it, I'll send it on over to Cynthia to share with the folks on this call. But there was a cartoon of Dr. King being interviewed by a reporter. And the reporter is like, oh, so, basically, how do you think today went? And basically behind Dr. King, there was fires everywhere, people getting arrested, it was chaos, right? That was the viewpoint of how he organized and how these actions were going by the newspapers and by many in the majority. They really looked at him as this horrible rabble rouser causing problems. Yeah, I agree with you wanting equality, but I just don't like the way that you do it. Right. So again, people really harken back now, especially those who want to justify a racist agenda, really harken back and say, oh, Dr. King really got it right. But at the time, Dr. King was not widely respected for what he was doing. That realization came around the time that he was murdered. And then the groundswell of, the Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act of, 1965, 1968, those acts coming into play. Now people are like, oh, I see what he was trying to do. And then they started to eulogize him and celebrate him. But that celebration was not happening at the time that he was alive. Want to fast forward when we're talking about the context of protest to Colin Kaepernick, right? So you think about Colin Kaepernick, starting taking a knee in the NFL offseason, and then how all of that sort of escalated to the point where he was being accused of not being a patriot, even though he sat down with a member of the military to figure out the most respectful way to protest and to raise his voice or use his platform to raise awareness around an issue. And the same arguments, again, were made against Colin Kaepernick, like, oh yeah, I agree that police brutality should end. I just don't think he should be doing it at work. I don't think he should be doing it on my Sunday when I'm trying to relax and watch football. Again, remember, protest by its very nature is meant to make people uncomfortable, right? There's no such thing as a comfortable protest. The fact of the matter is a protest is supposed to raise awareness and is to jar you out of complacency and encourage you to take a particular form of action to support a particular cause. So yeah, you're going to be uncomfortable watching him take a knee on Sunday, but think about how uncomfortable the people must be who are being brutalized that caused Colin Kaepernick to take a knee in the first place, right? Don't attack the messenger, look at the message and look at what's causing the person to protest in that way. Another parallel to draw, for instance, Elian Gonzalez. So for those of you who lived in Miami or lived in Florida for some time, you may have heard around 97, 98 about Elian Gonzalez, who was brought to America by his mother, and his mother died in the process of fleeing Cuba and fleeing the government and all the horrors that are happening there. So he comes ashore, his family that lives here took him in, but his father was still alive and living in Cuba and did not want him and the mother to come to Florida, to come to America. So basically a whole court case ensued, and the court made a determination here in the United States that a child is better off with their surviving family member. And even though he has, surviving family here, he has a surviving parent in Cuba, therefore he should be repatriated back to his father and to his home country. Well, protests broke out widely in the Cuban community in South Florida because of the fact that, they're like, listen, his mother gave his life for him to come here and have a better life. He has family members here. This is unjust. This is wrong. And it was to the point that the streets in Miami got shut down. I remember this vividly because I had moved here in 1997, and this happened somewhere around 97, 98. So this was like a massive introduction and lesson to me about the Cuban community and the folks here in exile and sort of the struggles that they went through. But I think about the response to their protests and how people were so supportive when they shut down Southwest 8th Street and all of that. And of course, the horrible photographs of, armed agents coming in and snatching Elian Gonzalez from his relative's home to be taken back basically by force to Cuba. And it was very jarring and it was very shocking. But you contrast that with the reaction to Colin Kaepernick. You contrast that to the reactions at the time of Dr. King, and now fast forward to today, you contrast that with the reaction to the HB 1, which got codified into law, what we call the anti-protest bill, where basically it was put in place to target Black and brown people that were protesting police brutality. And we saw how that played out when Cuban folks came out and were protesting what was happening in Cuba of late with regards to, less access to internet and really cracking down on human rights in Cuba. And folks came out and protest, and they basically shut down the Palmetto, and there were no arrests. Not saying there should have been, but it's interesting that this law was put in place purportedly to stop the blocking of highways. But then when somebody with a message that they found sympathetic or a voting bloc that they wanted to maybe make sure there was full support from, somehow it was like, oh, no, that protest is okay, but this protest is wrong. So again, looking at the rhythm of history and knowing that none of these things happen in a vacuum and none of these things are isolated, right? And just one final point on that before I sort of transition into talking about economics. You think about Bloody Sunday on the Edmund Pettus Bridge in Alabama, which should be named the John Lewis Bridge in Alabama, because that's where John Lewis, was one of the key leaders in that march and was brutalized by so many. Again, those folks that were protesting for equal rights and for African Americans to be treated equally and to be treated, with respect and as humans, they were basically blocking a whole bridge, right? They faced violence. So again, history continues to rhyme. We just have to learn from the past and take that with us, take those lessons, build on it, and be more sophisticated in making sure that we can raise our voices in a safe manner and that people's right to protest is preserved. Because remember, one thing I like to say is that Jim Crow grew up. He's now James Crow Esquire, and he has a very different game in the way that he approaches old problems. Now, pivoting to economics, really important to talk about that in the context of what Dr. King stood for, because he became incredibly dangerous when he started to talk about economic equality. So he was working to forge a much broader base of alliances with other groups at the time that he was murdered. So he was trying to bring together so many people under the umbrella of the Poor People's Campaign. Right? So when he was murdered, at the time that he was murdered, he was in Memphis trying to organize striking sanitation workers. While a good number of them were African American, there were white sanitation workers as well. He was trying to really build that bridge between poor whites and poor African Americans and really focusing on them like, listen, capitalism is your enemy. It's not each other, right? Because that whole strategy of divide and conquer, telling poor whites, which we saw very clearly under the last presidential administration, that it was, listen, none of these other people are doing anything for you. You've been marginalized. All of this wokeness, all of this political correctness, it's taking food off of your table, and they're letting, undocumented people come in and take your jobs, and all of this rhetoric was used to divide and conquer. And that is what shifted so many poor white folks from the Democratic Party, right, the old Democratic Party, to the Republican Party. That was the Southern strategy that was employed by Nixon, starting with Nixon and others, to really put that wedge and say, yeah, you're poor, but the reason why you're poor is because of Black and brown people, right? So Dr. King was starting to break through that when he was murdered. He said in Memphis, it's a crime for a rich nation, it's a crime in a rich nation for people to receive starvation wages. We've heard this kind of narrative again and again and again, especially now as, we legit have people being sent to space as tourists, right? But we still can't assure steady internet for all students in this country. So that, God forbid, there's a pandemic and you have to study at home, you have the ability to connect and go to school. We don't have a living wage for everyone to be able to, listen, if you worked at Starbucks, at Burger King, whatever, you can still feed yourself and your family. We still don't have that. History rhymes. So if you take the economic interests of poor people, the white folks in Appalachia who are in the coal industry, the Native Americans, African Americans, Puerto Rican, everyone down the line, and just regular working class folks, you have a majority coalition and you could see massive change. Also, he had made some statements about wanting to defund the military, right? We're basically taking away all of this money that was being funneled into wars. And, obviously the Vietnam War was just starting to ramp up. We had come out of the Korean War, all of this money being sent in the name of, fighting communism and all of that. He wanted to take that money and put it into jobs, healthcare, education. Any of this sounding familiar, right? So all of these are key concerns that resonate and continue to this day. And that, again, I submit to you, is when he got really dangerous and when the wheels had to be put in motion for him to be silenced. Because if he was able to break through that divide and conquer strategy, then it was going to be true people power. And that made him incredibly dangerous. In the same parallel, Fred Hampton of the Black Panther Party faced the same fate. He was murdered by the Chicago Police Department and the FBI, and now declassified documents are coming out and sharing more about what really happened. There was a movie on Netflix. I really encourage folks to watch it, called Black Messiah, and that really tells this Black Messiah and Judas. That tells the story of the informant, the FBI informant that was placed in the Black Panther Party in Chicago to follow Fred Hampton and to eventually set up his homicide. He became dangerous for the same reason, because he was actually building those coalitions the same way, bringing together poor whites, African Americans, Latine, Spanish-speaking folks, bringing them all together to address these same issues. And the power structure could not abide by that. And that resulted in his murder. And lastly, on the economic portion, FBI, and it was led by Hoover at the time, stated that the most dangerous Negro in the United States was Dr. Martin Luther King. Remember, the man that is being quoted like crazy by racists now to justify policies and all of that, at the time was named the most dangerous Negro in America by the FBI. History always rhymes. So now pivoting to allies and allyship, again, so many attempts to really whitewash his legacy by boiling it down to one moment in time, the I Have a Dream speech, which was powerful. It was amazing, not taking anything away from that. But he is as much that as he is letter from a Birmingham jail. In that letter, he calls out white moderates, saying, all the folks that, again, I'm going to really get into reading his actual words because they're so powerful. But he talks about the fact that, there's all these white moderates who are like, yeah, sure, right there, I support you, but not right now, not this way, and really want to police how liberation was being won. And, that was very disheartening and disturbing to him. However, he also was very clear to acknowledge the white folks that marched with him, right? Because remember, when you looked at the events on Bloody Sunday at the Edmund Pettus Bridge in Alabama, it was predominantly African American. But after that footage went worldwide, but really went nationwide, where the police were beating these nonviolent, unarmed protesters, so many folks were just so horrified. They flooded to Alabama for the next march to make sure that they stood in the gap, that their presence was felt, that they were making sure the message was heard that we are allies and we support what Dr. King is doing. And these are folks, if you look at some of those pictures, you see nuns in their habits, you see, Catholic priests, you see pastors of all denominations locked arm in arm, walking in support. You saw people of all races, of all, genders, identities, walking and fighting this fight. So he acknowledges them, right? He acknowledges the fact that the people of the Jewish faith have been instrumental allies due to their history of oppression, right? Because the reality is, listen, if you see somebody who's anti-Semitic, trust and believe they hate Black people. And generally, if you see a Klansperson who hates a Black person, they're not turning around and saying, yes, but I love Jewish people too, right? That hate is real and across the board. Whether you're a Proud Boy, whether you're a Nazi, whether you're a 3%er, it's all the same. They're all cut from the same cloth or the same hood, as it were. So I think always about the racist policies that get pushed by, different entities in the name of law and order. I think about some of the racist policies that were put in place, for instance, in my home of Miami Beach, around enforcement with regards to spring break and other high impact weekends where tourists of color come and are not treated equally to tourists of other races, right? I think about now the push to prevent people from videotaping the police in the execution of their duties in public. There's a bill right now in the legislature, I believe it's HB 11, if I'm not mistaken, criminalize being within 20 or 30 feet of a police officer and filming them while they're executing an arrest. Again, and then of course they'll turn around and be like, oh, quoting Dr. King, like I have a dream and a content of a character and all of this, but they still at the same token will push forward these policies that would then harm Black and brown communities. You can't quote Dr. King on Monday and push forward racist policies on Tuesday, because you know what? You're being disingenuous. And on that same vein, so many people I've heard say things like, oh, back in the day, I would have done the right thing. You know me, you know what I'm about. If it wasn't the slavery times or civil rights movement, I would have done the right thing. But what's really interesting about that is that folks are looking at the past from their comfort of the present, right? And when they talk about things happening present day, Colin Kaepernick, Black Lives Matter, murder of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Elijah McCain, so many others, right? They sit there and criticize today's efforts. They want to police the protests. How, why, when is a good time? How should you raise your voice? In what formation? What word tracks should you use? What slogan should you use, right? Here's the reality. Whatever you're doing now, you would have done back then. If you ain't speaking up now and trying to raise awareness and fight injustice and give your platform to marginalized people so that their messages can get out, then the reality is you would not have helped an enslaved person that was trying to escape. You would have not tried to provide assistance for someone being brutalized by a Klansperson or a police officer or anything like that because they're protesting not being able to eat at the same lunch counter. You wouldn't have done it, because the reality is there's so much less physical danger now, and there's ways to be able to raise awareness and lift your voice and support different causes without literally having to put your body on the line. Because remember, back in the day, we didn't have social media, right? You had to write a letter, you had to write an op-ed and hope that it gets published, right? Now you can write an op-ed and there's so many different blog outlets. There's, your local newspaper will run the content just to have something to really engage readers and all of that. You have your social media page that you could use. You have so many different ways that you could support the movement without actually literally putting your body on the line. And if you're not doing that now, don't come with the foolishness that, oh yeah, I would have helped somebody escape slavery. No, you wouldn't have, right? No, you wouldn't have. And to give that one last piece of context, think about Cheney, Schwerner, and Goodman, who were white people that sacrificed their lives to make sure that African Americans can vote. They're the topic of the movie Mississippi Burning. You can do some more research on that, but they walk the walk. There's also a 19-year-old young man who hopped on a Greyhound bus from New York to Alabama to help in the 60s with the efforts to make sure that everyone could have equal access to the ballot box. That man later fought for returning citizens to make sure that many of them being people of color, but that many of them would be able to get their voting rights back against a racist scheme, a racist, system. And this is something that he did when he was 19 and then did it again later on in life in his 60s and 70s. If you did it then, you'd do it now. And that man I'm referring to is Howard Simon. So there's always, I hold him up as what true allyship looks like, because he walked the walk. He put his body on the line. He put his, he used his pen, he used every tool at his disposal to fight for equality. And that's what an ally should do. So I'm going to, at this point, read some excerpts from a letter from a Birmingham jail, and then we can transition at that point into questions.
Great.
But when you have seen vicious mobs lynch your mothers and fathers at will, and drown your sisters and brothers at whim, when you have seen hate-filled policemen curse, kick, brutalize, and even kill your Black brothers and sisters with impunity, when you see the vast majority of your 20 million Negro brothers smothering in an airtight cage of poverty in the midst of an affluent society, when you suddenly find your tongue twisted and your speech stammering as you seek to explain to your 6-year-old daughter why she cannot go to the public amusement park that has just been advertised on television, and you see tears welling up in her little eyes when she was told that Funtown is closed to colored children, and see the depressing clouds of inferiority begin to form in her little mental sky, and you see her begin to distort her little personality by unconsciously developing a bitterness toward white people, when you have to concoct an answer for a 5-year-old son asking in agonizing pathos, "Daddy, why do white people treat colored people so mean?" When you are harried by day and haunted by night by the fact that you are a Negro, living constantly at tiptoe stands, never knowing what to expect next, and plagued with inner fears and outer resentments, when you are forever fighting a degenerating sense of nobodiness, then you will understand why we find it difficult to wait. He goes on to say, lukewarm acceptance is much more bewildering than outright rejection. My last excerpt is, I have almost reached the regrettable conclusion that the Negro's greatest stumbling block in his stride towards freedom is not the white citizens counselor or the Ku Klux Klanner, but the white moderate, who is more devoted to order, in quotes, than to justice, who prefers a negative peace, which is the absence of tension, to a positive peace, which is the presence of justice, who constantly says, open quote, I agree with you in the goal you seek, but I cannot agree with your methods of direct action, close quote, who paternalistically believes he can set the timetable for another man's freedom, who lives by a mythical concept of time, and who constantly advises the Negro to wait for a more convenient season. So in closing, I will say, don't be a stumbling block. Listen, learn, support, and amplify. And with that, I turn it back over to Cynthia for questions.
Great, excellent. Thank you. All right, do we have questions in the chat? While we are waiting for the questions to come pouring in, I would like to know more about your thoughts on the current anti-protest policies and how can we protest the anti-protest policies, and what do you foresee the future being with that?
Yeah, so with regards to the anti-protest policies, unfortunately, this is part of a greater national movement, all right? So one thing I will always say is that the conservative Republicans who don't support like civil rights, civil liberties, and all of that, they have been mobilizing for a long time. right? This is not in the last, couple months, they kind of pull it together and they're trying to get some offices, right? They had a strategic plan to get the state houses, to get the governor's mansions. And right now, what's mobilizing is them getting control of school boards, as well as attorney general's offices, to be able to undo elections and, be able to push forth the agenda that they want to see. So this anti-protest bill didn't come out in a vacuum. This wasn't, the current governor just kind of waking up one day and deciding to do this. This is a bill that's been introduced in various forms, some more extreme than others, around the country and in more conservative states. So what I see as the way forward on this is, number one, to make sure that we are very mindful when we protest and that we are very organized when we protest. What do I mean by that? It means, number one, getting permits, right? Supporting other organizations when they're trying to put together a protest, put in the sweat equity to be like, okay, let's strategize this route. Let's make sure that we have permits or that we stay on public streets, whether it may be having allies liaison with law enforcement, because again, one point that was brought up, rightfully or wrongfully so, but I'm putting it out there, there was discussion that when the Cuban folks shut down 826 to protest, they had law enforcement support, right? That they get given them the heads up and all of that. Now, granted, there's a whole lot of cultural other undertones as to why that is and what may have happened, but there may be an avenue for allies to be like, listen, we're supporting this protest. This is happening. We're going to be, ACLU is going to be there as monitors to watch and all of that, to basically give the heads up that, hey, listen, we're watching what's going on. So this is not going to be a situation where you can disparately treat this group who's protesting around, police brutality versus another group of, let's say suburban moms that are protesting for reproductive justice, right? And not saying that that's the only group protesting. I'm just using that as an example, right? Because the treatment in theory could be very disparate because of what the crowd looks like, right? So, you think about the Women's March, right? there was no police brutality at that, right? But you think about some of the other protests around the death of George Floyd, and there was police violence in some of those protests. So, that allyship, that standing in the gap, which we saw, for instance, in Portland, when protests got heated, you had the wall of moms and the leaf blower dads. So you had the wall of white moms who were coming out and literally putting their body in between law enforcement and people of color protesting, knowing that the police were not going to run through them to get to the people of color. And then you had the leaf blower dads who came with literal leaf blowers strapped to their back. I was like, that is so Oregon. But anyway, because I don't see anybody in Miami rolling out with a leaf blower. But be that as it may, they came out with leaf blowers to dissipate the tear gas, so that the people were able to stay and continue to protest and not suffer the adverse effects. So those are some ways that allies can really come in and help protect people of color when they're protesting, to make sure that their voices get heard. But in the long game, this is the short game. The long game is to do what the conservative Republicans are doing and out organize, and make sure that awareness is being raised around every single elected office. You hear me? Every single one. I'm talking about dog catcher all the way to governor, right? Because that is how we are able to push back these policies, is making sure that there's people empowered in Tallahassee to be like, no, this is not a good idea, right? On both sides of the aisle, to be like, this is not a good idea. And if we don't have that, if we don't have those reasonable voices, we're going to continue to see these horrible policies, keep perpetuating time after time. I think it's very safe to say that this current governor has been extremely hostile to civil rights and civil liberties. So what are we doing about that? Because TikTok, listen, the election's coming this November. What are we doing? right? What are we doing to make sure that everybody is educated and remembers his track record, remembers that he's the one that spearheaded this, that he's the one that is pushing, you know, the 6-week abortion ban, that he's pushing that, you know, not teaching critical race theory and accurate history in schools. He's pushing all of that. This is his agenda. What are we doing to make sure that people are clear on that and vote accordingly? Because if we're not doing the work in the ballot box, we're going to be protesting forever. And we're going to keep protesting the same things over and over again, because the same people get in power, stay in power, and are able to implement these policies without any real resistance. So.
Yes. Thank you. Okay. I'm going to let that sit for a minute with everybody. Listen.
Let that marinate.
Let that marinate. So someone says, I just wanted to thank Ms. Pearson so much for uplifting that letter. Brought tears to my eyes, incredibly powerful. And I think that is important. You're right. People aren't as familiar with the less feel-good moments, and we need to hear things that are convicting. Maybe another noteworthy film is Crip Camp, as it also goes into how the Black Panther Party contributed to the Section 504 protest. Everything is intersectional.
Yeah.
Okay.
I will add that to my queue. Okay.
Okay. Were there any predominantly white groups that supported Dr. King in his push for economic equality, labor unions or religious groups? Question mark.
I don't know the exact names right now, but I do know that the labor unions were supportive as long as they were able to get past the racism aspect, right? So there was a lot of work that had to be done behind the scenes to build those bridges. But, you know, for sure, the labor movement was supportive of him because better wages, right? Because at the end of the day, everybody needs to eat. And that's, I think, the lesson that always comes from this is when you really speak to people's commonalities, you know, that is how you're able to make change, right? You think about President Obama and how he was successful and going to Iowa and all these places that you would never think would embrace a Black man, and certainly not a Black man running for president, right? But he was able to speak to their commonalities and talk about issues that meant something to them, which then made them think, you know what, he's not so bad. You know, let me move past, you know, I won't want my daughter to marry him, but I'll vote for him, right? Real talk, real talk. But at the end of the day, you got somebody in who was able to implement certain policies that then benefited everybody. So there was that aspect. With regards to religious groups, I know that the Jewish faith-based community was extremely supportive of the civil rights movement and Dr. King. I know that certain religious factions, you know, like the Catholic Church, not necessarily as a body as in the Pope, but like, you know, certain regional Catholic churches and networks were supportive. I know the Quakers were incredibly supportive as well and came to many protests and put their bodies in the line. So yeah, there were definitely a number of different groups that were supportive, but it's just the other folks, especially those who have something to lose, right? If you are part of the power structure, you may not really want all that equality. You may say that you're for it, right? But it may affect, or you may perceive that it could affect your power or your ability to do certain things. So you may not come all out and support it and kind of stay quiet and stay in the background and not be supportive in the background, because there's a difference between, listen, I'm not going to come out and say a whole bunch of stuff because I need to protect my seat, but in the background, I'm going to funnel money, resources, and all that. I'm going to connect you to what you need to be successful. That's not who he was talking about. You know, he's talking about the people saying, oh, stand down, right? Like, oh, the change has to happen incrementally. It can't all happen at the same time. Yeah, it can. Yeah, it can, because the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act prove that. Because once you start to see riots, you know, around the country, once you saw the riots that were in response to the murder of Dr. King, bills got passed really quick, right? Because they saw the unrest and they knew that they had to move. It was sort of parallel to the same response we saw initially after the death of George Floyd and that push to really bring forth a comprehensive bill on policing. We saw a lot of movement in Congress, but we couldn't get the Senate to move, right? So there was that groundswell, but it wasn't enough. And it wasn't as urgent as in people saw that their seats were going to be, at risk. They just didn't, they were still being held hostage by the last presidential administration. So they're not willing to do the right thing because they're like, oh, if I come out and try to support this, I'm going to be labeled as woke and now I'm going to lose my seat, right? So all of those things came into play and prevented the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act from being passed. So again, history, it rhymes.
Okay, so now, I'm sorry, I'm Googling. People are asking about some very specific bills and acronyms, and I'm Googling them because I'm terrible with acronyms. And I don't know that everyone is familiar with all of this. Anyway, there's a few different ones, but the first question is, was ALEC involved in HB1? And I Googled ALEC because I'm not even familiar with acronyms that I use on a daily basis. And I'm assuming they're referring to the American Legislative Exchange Council.
Yeah. I do not know if they were involved in that. I do know that they were very instrumental in a lot of legislation, pushing forward like private prisons. They were very instrumental in the legislation for the stand your ground laws that we saw in Florida, as well as around the country. Literally, they would just draft the legislation, send it to their legislators. Their legislators, even in one case, didn't even bother to take the ALEC logo off of it and filed it as is, right? It was that brazen. And this was in another state around a stand your ground law. But legit, that's just how they move. And if you watch the movie 13th on Netflix, it talks about ALEC's involvement in some of these pieces of legislation that really fueled mass incarceration. But I can't say specifically ALEC was involved in HB1, although I would not be surprised because, again, that piece of legislation mirrors so much of what we're seeing around the country. There's basically a draft going around that people are just cutting and pasting from and then editing to be like, oh, okay, so being allowed to run over protesters with your car is a bridge too far. All right, we'll take that out. But we'll also make sure to still leave in the ability to get, civil remedy if you felt that your store was damaged as a result of a protest, even though the person you're suing had nothing to do with the protest directly and all of that. So.
Okay. If MLK was alive today, what do you think he would say about the current climate of racial justice?
Oof. I think he would say much the same things as he did in the past, because things are different now from the standpoint of, yeah, I can pretty much go into any restaurant I want and sit where I want, right? But now racial justice went from being more, dealing with overt racism to dealing with institutional and structural racism and dealing with polite racism. I like to call it the Canadian form of racism, right? And I say that jokingly because I did spend a lot of time in Canada, and it's one of those things where you're like, oh no, people aren't racist in Canada, but then it's like, oh, actually, the way they did, they're just super polite. They're just not going to call you the N-word to your face, but they're going to support policies that are not going to benefit you, as seen. And, for instance, how Indigenous people were treated in Canada and being, forced away from their families, being rehomed to white families, stripping them of their identity. The Canadian government just came out and, issued an apology with regards to that. But, but so anyway, I digress. But, it's just, much like he said, that sort of like that outright rejection is almost better in some ways than that lukewarm acceptance. And so what we're dealing with right now is lukewarm acceptance. So his words from then resonate the same way now. And I think he would say much the same of keep organizing, boots on the ground, knock doors, raise awareness, and use whatever platform you have to make sure that people understand what's at stake and that they utilize their right to vote, how to vote, and what they need to vote for. So I think he would say much the same then as he did that.
This question feeds into what you just said, and I think you've answered this in part, so if, or possibly in total, but if you want to add or, so their question is basically where to put our protest. Is it more effective to focus on statewide legislation or on small scale implementations? Or does it matter where you happen to be, you know, where your connections are, is what I think I'm hearing you say. But
yeah, I think there's a couple different ways to go about it. First of all, I'm a big fan of one quote I always say is, when they go low, we go local. Right? Because so much change can happen at the local level if you have a sympathetic mayor and city council or county commission or whatever. You know, you can implement, you know, human rights ordinances, for instance, right? You can implement, you know, Crown Act type things where people can't be discriminated against for wearing their natural hair in the workplace or anything like that. You know, for instance, Miami Beach had a ordinance that does not allow you to film a police officer within 20, 30 feet of you know, them executing an arrest. And well, that went all the way sideways when somebody was arrested for filming the cops beating the crap out of somebody. The cops ended up getting charged for that battery, and the person, obviously the charges got dropped, and now the Miami Beach, you know, a city commission was like, we're gonna have to put a pause on that ordinance because that's not quite what we intended. Well, hello, if you had asked somebody, we would have told you from the get-go that this was a bad idea. But anyway, be that as it may, thank you for coming to the party. You know, the reality is folks can organize in Miami Beach and make sure that that ordinance gets taken off the books, and then also keep organizing to make sure that when it comes to high impact weekends, people of color are being treated equally, et cetera, et cetera. So, you know, if you have a microcosm of a good government that you can really work with, you can implement changes locally, and then those local changes can be a model. So that way, when you go statewide, you can say, listen, we did this in, you know, in Tampa, or we did this in Deltona, and listen, city is doing perfectly well. You know, place is not on fire. Things are great. If we did this policy statewide, more people could benefit, right? So I think there's a lot of benefit in that local groundswell, and also having that victory. Right? Because it's pretty demoralizing when you go up to Tallahassee year after year and the bills that you're advocating for don't pass, and the bills that you're fighting do pass, and you're just like, what am I doing? Right? Getting that local boost of being able to get things done locally is positive momentum that makes you want to keep fighting, that makes you want to stay in the game longer and strategize how else to do this. So I think there's utility in doing both, but I think you should be doing a lot in your own backyard because it's easier to explain. It's easier for people to get their minds around because it's something they see on a day-to-day basis, as opposed to, well, that's something happening in Tallahassee. I don't know exactly how that affects me here.
So this next question is, what's your best estimate for the percentage of people happy to support repressive and anti-democratic policies versus the proportion against them?
So I would say probably 30% actively support these kind of policies. I'd say probably about 40% of people actively, well, maybe 30% actively fight those policies, but the rest are ambivalent. And that's the problem.
Scary.
Problem is the ambivalence, right? Because the hardcore people that are supportive, they're going to do what they do, right? Like, listen, I'd love to say we're all going to get to a place of utopia, very like super Woodstock, like we're all like hanging out, kumbaya, smoking a police pipe in a drum circle, right? I would love for that to be like the norm for everyone, and that's just how our country is. I don't see that ever happening, right? You're always going to have the Proud Boys. You're always going to have these like racist fringe elements. They're always going to be there, right? And we're always going to have the hardcore folks, like everybody on this call, I would assume everybody on this call, everybody in the ACLU universe or whatever, who fights for civil rights, civil liberties, and they're gonna throw down and do what needs to be done. But it's the people in the middle who aren't particularly engaged, don't vote in every election, all of that. Their ambivalence is what causes a lot of these policies to flourish and a lot of these mindsets to really a vocal minority to end up taking over everything. So.
That's sobering, but true. Okay.
I always say I'm the bringer of good news. I'd like to be, but.
Well, when you're talking about history rhyming, and you mentioned, it was really the assassination of Dr. King that precipitated so much of this major change. When you look at what is happening right now and how horrifying so many of things appear to be, is that 100% discouraging, or is there part of that that feels like this is an opportunity for some real change? And how far off this little precipice do you feel we are?
So we're in a bad way. Our democracy legit is in danger. When we're in a place where we can all agree on the facts. Now, we can disagree in our perception and where forward and all of that. I think about back in the day when I was growing up, not going to tell my age, but I'm sure y'all can extrapolate. I grew up with like 4 channels, right? And I grew up in New York. So it was like, ABC, no, not even, it was CBS, NBC, ABC, PBS, and then Channel 11, WPIX kind of came in the mix a little later on, so everybody got their news from like the same 3 channels, right? Everybody got their 5 o'clock, 6 o'clock news and 11 o'clock news from the same channels. And the news was pretty much told the same way. So everybody had the same basis of information. They just chose to interpret it differently, right? Now we're not even working from the same basis of information. Like the fact that we're even debating whether or not January 6th was a sightseeing tour or a coup attempt is like mind-boggling, right? So that is what's really dangerous. And I know that, when we're thinking about free speech and we don't want to obviously, stifle that or anything else, but then we look at the role that so many social media platforms played in disseminating false information with no check or balance, right? I see that some of these platforms are supposedly trying to make some moves to correct that and shut down accounts that are, sending out misinformation and all of that. But I feel like I don't know how we get to a place where we're all singing from at least the same set of facts and going back to, okay, well, let's debate the issues. Let's debate policy, right? Not debating what actually happened. I don't know how we get to that point. I don't know if we're too far gone, because I think about, all countries go through turmoil, right? And we're a young country, in the scheme of things. Listen, people in France got like shoes older than our country, right? So, we're going to go through some ebbs and flows, some ups and downs. And right now, I think we're in a down. I'm hoping that we're going to build our way back up now that, people saw how bad things can get and that they won't sit on the sidelines. But again, complacency is evil. And folks get complacent from the standpoint of, listen, is somebody banging down my door trying to kill me? No? All right, well, I'm just going to continue to go about my life. So that's where organizing and educating forums like this, all the work that all of you are doing in your communities is so important, because you got to keep raising that awareness. And we now have to play the role of not only just raising awareness, but legit educating folks on the basics. Right? That's why I love to talk about Letter from a Birmingham Jail and all that, because a lot of folks don't know that. And if the schools aren't teaching it, we're going to have a whole new generation of folks coming out that have no clue about the context of how we got to where we are. So we have to take it upon ourselves to educate ourselves, to make sure that we're singing from the fact sheet, the true facts, and we're educating people accordingly, that all the people in our network, in our circle, know accurate information. And then they, like kind of the spindle snowflake theory, they send it out to their folks and we educate our communities that way.
Thank you. Well, we're out of time. This has been excellent. Thank you for sharing your time with us again. You're always so engaging. I want to just have you all the time. Everybody else, please stay tuned for our recurring series topics. We're in the process of getting those lined up. And you can now unmute yourselves and show your appreciation. Yay!
Thank you.
Thanks, Melba.
Thank you, Melba.
Thank
We
you.
love you, Melba.
Hey, thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Have an amazing
Oh, I'm
day.
back. I'm
Yeah.
going for a bike ride. I guess you already went for a bike ride to Dixon or someplace?
Yeah.
How was it?
Someone's
pretty
going for a
good.
bike
And
ride.
actually,
Okay.
this is the very last moment of her thing. Hey,
Really?
We should end with a chant. Yes, we can. Yes, we can. Yes, we can. Yes, we
Yes,
can.
we
All right.
can.
I got to go throw some food in and go for a fast bike ride. So if you don't want to come with me, then
I
don't.
did 28 miles.
I want to go with you.
Right?
Okay, yeah.
I was like, I'm a little far.
I want to go. I want some dinner and a bike ride. Okay. All right. Thank you so much. And thank you everyone for being here. And Melba, I'm sure you'll hear from us again.
Sounds good. Take good care, y'all. And thank you again for the invite. And keep fighting a good fight.
All right. Thanks. Bye.
Bye.